Anyways, I say I'm very honored to be here, and my talk builds on the back of many, many, many scholars. So I am going to spend the next hour and a half listing all of their names to you. But I could. It would take certainly that long. But I do really want to acknowledge two individuals who did certainly influence me in many ways. And they both been mentioned before, but Frederick Dovington Nichols, who taught architectural history, and Jefferson at the university, and then Mario di Valmarana, who brought me here to Vicenza back in 1981. Jefferson, of course, is so well known for his many different accomplishments, political, cultural, intellectual. I'm not going to go into any of those. But there is, of course, the architecture side. And as you all know, Palladio is my Bible. Stick to it. He owned many different editions, but in particular, I'm sorry to have to admit that he liked this English edition, the London edition, translated by Giacomo Leone, or James Leone. This in particular was his favorite. But also, as he said, and I quote, "Architecture is my passion, and putting up and pulling down my greatest endeavor." And he is totally involved in architecture. I think it's safe to say all of his life. Jefferson on health is a big and complex aspect that I have to admit has not been totally studied. There is in his writings, and of course there are only 25,000 letters that we can read and so forth, but there is very frequently mentions about health and the importance of it. And indeed in a letter written in July 1787, while he is abroad in Paris, and just to note, he spent 1784 to 1789, he lived basically in Paris, though traveled extensively throughout Europe, though very oddly he never made it here. And that's one of the great puzzles of all time, why he didn't come to Vicenza or Rome. I've tried to talk to him about it different times at night, but anyway, but he does write it there, and he says, and this is that an attention to health should take place of every other object. Without health, there is no happiness. And I would say that is something that is that's constant. Another thing that is very involved in his health is that he believes in walking. And he is constantly admonishing different individuals and so forth, really throughout his life, that you ought to, and I quote here, "I repeat my advice to take a great deal of exercise on foot. Health is the first requisite after morality." Another letter, "If the body be feeble, the mind will not be strong. I have known some great walkers, and I have never known or heard of one who is not healthy and long-lived." And he goes on and he says that you should do at least 3 to 5 miles a day. The issue of health, of course, does fit in to some degree. Monticello, which of course the name is suggested by Mr. Palladio. But I put up on the right, and it's very hard to get an example of pollution in Paris from the 18th century, so this is 19th century view. But another thing that is a strong element in his letters and writings and so forth, and that is that while he is thinking, we think of him as sort of a nature boy, he spent a good portion of his life actually living in cities. And there is a constant refrain when he visits London, but while he lived in Paris, and that was that the air is no good and the water's unwholesome. So he was very concerned. About that. Now, in my talk today, I am not going to concentrate on Monticello. His houses and so forth; those would be something that one can, I think, take up in a different time. And actually, as I say, I think that there needs to be more research that is done on them. But I am going to focus on the University of Virginia. And this is not simply his greatest work of architecture, but a college or a university It was designed very specifically for healthful living, intended to be a harmonizing environment that would inspire and teach through its architecture. We've heard several times the quote of Edgar Allan Poe. I'm not going to repeat it again, but Poe, of course, is one of the first students there. But in two of his poems, Tales of the Ragged Mountain and To Helen, he talks about the grandeur that was Rome, Rome and Greece. But what I'm going to do in this is to bring up the whole issue, of course, what is it that he is reacting against? And this is where, on the bottom, is where he went to college, the College of William and Mary down in Williamsburg. And he spent about 3 years there. While he was there, all of the students, the central building right here, all of the some 40-odd white males, and 6 of the 7 faculty. The 7th faculty was the president, lived over here. This is a school for Native Americans or Indians. It was here. But all 40 of the students and the faculty lived in this one building. And descriptions of life there are like if you ever saw a movie a number of years ago called Animal House. Well, anyway, this was very much that, a constant chaos of a lot of that. Everybody was packed in, and Jefferson in several different places. But he says, and I quote, "I am long convinced that the large and crowded buildings in which youths are pent up are equally unfriendly to health, to study, to manners, morals, and order." In other words, these single large buildings were really a big, big problem. And I just put it in as another example, as you can see up in the top. But this is what all American colleges and universities was essentially one large building. And so he really is very much in the idea that you ought to avoid the single large building. So now coming back to the University of Virginia, of course, this is what we think of it today. And it does have a large building at the end, which is a complex story, which I'm not going to get totally into here, but basically serves as the library for it. But the real issue of the University of Virginia, and I think most of you know it, is that it's this broad lawn with the student rooms located here, the professors occupying the pavilions, and you went from class to class across it. In other words, in a certain sense, you were living out in the countryside. Now, a very quick summary of the history of the design of the University of Virginia. In 1814, an idea grows up in Charlottesville about creating a local academy, the Albemarle Academy, which if you're not familiar, that we live in the county of Albemarle, the Albemarle Academy. And Jefferson is roped into the project by a couple of his friends. And, of course, being Jefferson, he takes over the entire project. And this is 2 sides of the single sheet of paper. If you look at the corners down there, you can see it's double sides. And what he comes up with is this huge U-shaped scheme with 9 pavilions, student rooms in between, gardens here, 257 yards across. These are the specs. And then on the other side, he shows what this would look like. These are the professor's pavilion, with down here where the classroom would be taking place, the students living in these rooms, and then the covered walkway to shelter you in weather. And of course, what the issue is here is, where does this idea come from? Now, the idea does change over time. And what happens is that he decides that he needs some advice, because he's just sold all of his books to the Library of Congress, some 6,700 and odd books, and he didn't have his architecture books. So he writes off a letter, 2 letters actually. This is one of them right here, the first one, to 2 architect friends, Benjamin Henry Latrobe and William Thornton. And in this letter, he says to them, and I won't do all of it, but you can see he has a sketch down here, the grass and trees. He says, "I ask your advice because I am going to create this college, this school, and the fronts of the pavilions are to be no 2 alike. They are to be specimens to the architectural lectures. Or in other words, you are to learn from the environment, that the environment you are in is is to be an inspiration. Mr. Thornton and Mr. Latrobe do write back with their suggestions, and I'm taking a look at them right here. This is Thornton, as you can see on this side, Latrobe on the other side. And Latrobe is one of the people that I think we can blame for the rotunda up here. But still, at this point in time, this is still this gigantic, wide sort of a scheme. What happens is that, of course, and this is something that every architect knows, you got a great idea, but then, damn it, I've got a site. I've got to fit the building into the site. And how in the heck is that thing going to fit? And the site was a very rolling sort of thing. His earlier scheme would be great if he was out in Iowa or something like that. But he has to fit it in, and so the thing gets squeezed down. And from 257 yards, it becomes 180 feet across like this. You've got your different pavilions, your different student rooms. They add these ranges that are out here. These are the gardens. And, of course, this is the rotunda up there. And so there is the issue of site. But more than this, the real issue is where does this idea come from for this open, U-shaped type of a scheme? And this is something that the scholars have argued on endlessly, and there is a tremendous amount of writing on this and so forth. And I think that there are several different possibilities. And on one hand, you can say that it sort of represents the U-shaped scheme that you see in some of Palladio's villas. But also, we have to keep in mind that he had traveled rather extensively. He had been in England. He had gone to Oxford. He had seen the quadrangles and so forth. And there certainly may be something, and we can just pick out some of the different colleges and so forth there. We don't have to go through every damn one and so forth. But it is interesting that he doesn't pick out this enclosed type of thing. It is much more of an open type of project. So where did that idea also come from? Well, a couple of different suggestions. One suggestion is this. In August, early September 1784, Jefferson landed at Portsmouth on the south coast of Great Britain. And he spent about 6 days there before he went on over to Le Havre and to Paris. But he was there for about 6 days. And during that time he was in Portsmouth, he went up to Gosport to visit a lady friend from Virginia. And while he does not say anything about it, you had to see it when you got into Gosport. You see it today, as you see this Royal Hospital. And I think you can pick out here exactly what I'm talking about. This is this end, this is elevation down here, but here is the other side of this. And as I say, he never mentions anything about this, but you're landed right there, and given who he was and so forth, he certainly took a peek or something like that. And one of the things is that I have spent a considerable amount of time over the years is sort of running down where it is that he did visit when he was abroad. Where is it that he visited different places? What are the things that he might have seen? And so if you begin to look at the 17th and the 18th century English design for hospitals and also the French designs for hospitals, you see that there is a strong similarity between this, such as this one here, and this is a building that he had to see when he was in London. He spent 4 weeks in London, but this is just a model, of course, right here, but of the Royal Hospital down in Chelsea, Chelsea by Christopher Wren. So this is one possibility. Another possibility is this, a building that is somewhat neglected today, and not enough attention is paid to it, but Guy's Hospital, which is located down on the South Bank, down in Southward. While he was in London, he was cruising all over the place, and I think it's not too hard to think of that this might be a possibility. Another possibility to just keep in mind is that he did spend 5 years in Paris, and he walked every day up and down the Seine. He had 4 different houses, but his permanent house, he passed this every damn day that he was in Paris. And of course, today we think of this as primarily a museum, but what it was a hospital for the invalids. And again, one can see a certain sort of a similarity that is going on here between the open court, the way that you have the arcades coming around, and of course, the dominant building by Mansard that you have there. Now, what I am trying to say here is that this is, and have to be careful, because there's nothing that us historians like better than say, aha, he saw that, that's where it leads to, and so forth. And I'm not trying to say that, but I'm trying to say that this is a type of idea that probably germinated a little bit in his mind. And then what is also very, very fascinating is that while he was in Paris, there was considerable fuss going on, and a lot of different designs came forth for a design of a new hospital that would be there on the Seine, as you can see. And this one here, it's just not hard to figure out once again that here's the main structure up here. Here are the different pavilions and so forth for the invalides and all of this, and that this is not something that is dissimilar. And while, again, I can't prove that he actually owned this book, because unfortunately he sold those damn books, and some of them we don't have any longer, but this is something that was very, very much in the air about the design of this hospital, this hospital in Paris. So, as I say, I am maybe leaping out here, and the gangplank is beginning to creak a little bit and so forth. And yet at the same time, there is such a strong relationship between what happens at the University of Virginia in the idea of this open type of a scheme, that the students have this easy access to the out of doors. They're not pent up in one single large building. The idea of fresh air, the idea of connection with nature, the idea of movement back and forth between taking a lecture with a class as a professor here or a seminar, and your rooms that are located along. And here we are back to it. And it still is today, I think one can say, it is this sort of an inspirational, sort of inspiration. But the other thing, and I think it's one of the themes that has sort of led through here, whether we've been talking about literature, or of course here we are, we're talking about architecture, is that you ought to learn from your environment. That the buildings that you're in is part of your education. That they shouldn't be blank, sort of boring boxes, but that they should be something that gives an inspiration to you. And that was very much his idea with the different fronts of the different pavilions, as you can see here. And we say we're taking these off of Palladio on the right, and a French book, Chambray, located here on the left. But that this is very much a part of this. Two footnotes, very brief footnotes. Lewis Nelson, who will be coming along in a minute, will take up on these. But one of his very last designs at the university, he had just hired a professor of anatomy from London. And this professor came over and discovered he was supposed to be cutting up cadavers downstairs with his wife and kids living upstairs. And he didn't think too much of that, and so he asked Jefferson. And so Jefferson designs this anatomical theater, which is a building that unfortunately no longer exists, but here is his drawings for it right here. You can see an elevation. This is a section. On the ground floor, he has museum ? And then here is where you have the anatomical theater with the seating and the exercise and so forth taking place here. This is labeled charnel over here. This is where the body parts go. The other footnote to this is that some of us the other day had the wonderful experience of going to Padua and to see the very first botanical garden. And this is something else that was a big passion of Jefferson. And especially while he was abroad, he visited wherever he went the botanical gardens, in some cases double, 3 and 4 times. He, of course, never came down to Padua to see this, but he did visit both of these. This is Oxford, as you can see on the right, the Jardin des Plantes in Paris, which he visited very, very frequently, and that this becomes a really big thing to him. So right prior to his death, as the university is being completed, He purchases 25,000 plant specimens and plans for a botanical garden. If you know the University of Virginia, it would be over where Alderman Library is, going down the hillside. But then, unfortunately, he kicks the bucket. And the professor he had put in charge of it, named William Emmett, and a typical university professor, after Jefferson died, he says, it's too much work, I can't do it. And so the damn thing never got built. But we did have a wonderful student, Lily Berger, who a couple of years ago did this wonderful study of this, and what you can see up there in the background, there's the rotunda, that's the Anatomical Theater, she came up with a scheme for probably what the botanical garden would have looked like if it had been designed. So in the end, what I am trying to stress here is that we have a very conscious creation of an environment that is intended to inspire, which education is a priority, but it is part of the buildings themselves, and it is also dedicated to healthful living. Thank you very much.